Thank you. Well, and indeed, it's been a warm welcome. Thank you so much for all your kind words and for all of you braving the heat to come to this session. I'd like to begin by thanking Dr. Sumana Dasgupta and Dr. Minakshi Gopinath and the entire WISCOMP team for the very warm welcome to Delhi, and also Akash Lina, who has been answering my multitude of questions since I landed in Delhi. It is my first time here, so I do apologize in advance. Um, I'm so honored to be kickstarting this series. And I'd like to contextualize it by showing a video so that you kind of, it's a bit of a projection into my world for the last 6 or 7 years.
The path to peace in Mozambique was long. On the 4th of October 1992, the Rome General Peace Accord was signed by the former president of Mozambique, Joaquim Chissano, and Afonso Dhlakama, then leader of Renamo. This peace lasted for decades, with Mozambique developing visibly. Unfortunately, this first agreement did not bring lasting peace to the country, and further peace talks began in 2013. A second peace agreement was signed in 2014, but was short-lived, with violence re-emerging a year later. Another unsuccessful process, known as the Avenida process, followed. Despite these failings, the will to find peace remained strong. In late 2016, President Filipe Jacinto Nyusi signaled openness to direct talks with the Renamo leader Afonso Dhlakama, and the current peace process was born. President Nyusi and Dhlakama invited Switzerland and its ambassador Mirko Manzoni to provide good offices to support peace negotiations. Both parties sought to outline a new course and process that would culminate in a peace agreement to achieve a definitive peace. In December of 2016, the mediators, the then Swiss ambassador to Mozambique, Mirko Manzoni, Neha Sanghrajka, Kenyan, Jonathan Powell, British, and Eduardo Namburit, Mozambican, facilitated direct and continued dialogue between President Nyusi and Dhlakama. This dialogue resulted in a ceasefire announced on December 27, 2016.
The Mozambican people can now today trust that their leaders will choose dialogue and peace over conflict and guns.
The process was organized along two thematic commissions, the Military Affairs Commission and the Commission on Decentralization. Switzerland established the Peace Process Secretariat to support the process and the two commissions' work. Through its chairpersonship of the contact group, Ambassador Manzoni coordinated the international community's support. The mediators traveled frequently to the bush to facilitate negotiations between both parties. These trips helped build the bridges of trust and confidence in the process. Negotiations continued with Dhlakama until his sudden death in May 2018. The mediators worked with the new Renamo leadership, led by Yusufu Mamad, to keep the peace process on track. On May 23, 2018, the Parliament unanimously approved the proposal to revise the Constitution to deepen decentralization. The Memorandum of Understanding on Military Affairs, signed in August 2018, laid the groundwork for disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, DDR, including the placement of Renamo officials in leadership positions within the armed forces and national police. On July 29, 2019, former Renamo combatants began the first phase of the registration process for DDR. These commitments to the peace process were sealed by signing the definitive cessation of a military hostilities agreement and the Maputo Accord for Peace and National Reconciliation between President Filipe Nyusi and Renamo leader Yusufu Mamad in August 2019.
Queremos garantir ao nosso povo e ao mundo que enterramos a lógica da violência como forma de resolução das nossas diferenças.
Hoje, estamos a demonstrar de forma clara a força do diálogo e a importância da confiança na resolução de conflitos políticos. Hoje é o início do verdadeiro processo de reconciliação, condição necessária para consolidar a paz efetiva maior, democratização e desenvolvimento econômico e social.
Acknowledging Switzerland's central role in the peace process, the United Nations Secretary-General appointed Mirko Manzoni as his personal envoy for Mozambique to support the implementation of the peace accord.
It was very genuine, very honest, and that was the key of the process. I believe that it will be the last one, and the country will move forward and have a very bright future. They deserve.
Despite several challenges, including the COVID-19 pandemic, in June 2020, the government and Renamo resumed DDR activities in central Mozambique and have successfully demobilized all 5,221 former combatants, including 271 women who have settled in communities across the country. Today, Mozambicans can look forward to a future of peace, prosperity, and sustainable development.
Thank you. So I hope that that is a little bit of a start to what I'm about to say this evening. I'm what you might call an unlikely mediator or negotiator, a woman of color, Indian descent, but from the African continent. I'm also an accidental one. I never quite set out to work in this field at all. But I suppose in some ways, life or the universe just led me to it. I don't typically, and after all this talk on mediation, I digress to say that I don't typically like to refer to myself as a mediator or a negotiator. I've had so many roles in this one peace process, from negotiator to facilitator, depending on who the audience is. Depending on the context, we had to be able to play any role at any time. But to achieve the overarching goal of a sustainable agreement. My experience began in my home country of Kenya, as Dr. Gopinath said, when an electoral dispute in 2007 turned into a broader conflict. I spent 7 years working on what one might call a classical mediation. So there was a conflict, mediators were sent in by either the African Union or the UN. There was a peace talks, and then a peace agreement, peace process signing, and then the implementation. So it was sequential. However, times have changed, and my experience in Mozambique has led me to see that that kind of classical mediation, I'm not sure work now. And after, as you've seen in the video, 2 or 3 failed attempts, we finally landed on one that did succeed, which is why I'm going to concentrate my lessons or anything that I have to say on this topic on what I've learned and done in Mozambique. Change being the only constant, we're living in a changing world of massive technological advancement, economic uncertainty, fear about the consequences of change. There's increasing interstate, intrastate, and internationalized conflicts on a planet that's warming rapidly, driving further instability and insecurity. There are new power dynamics at play, new voices. Or rather, these voices have always been there, the global south. However, they're now louder and they're growing. And I think that's the difference. So it's super significant and symbolic that the African Union membership for the G20 happened under the auspices of India. I mean, this was one of my sort of major reasons to say yes to this. We now need more than ever member states, individuals who are able to bridge actors, interests, and spaces. There's a rise in new players, new mediators to play a role in finding common ground, building trust, and cooperation across the divide. So with that, I'd like to speak to 4 elements that help transform our challenges into opportunities. First, building trust. We so often hear the terminology, peace talks. I try very hard not to use that anymore. I try to use more peace listening. I mean, maybe you're right. I do kind of change up the words a little bit because I do believe that we need to change the way we do things. The norms are not working anymore. So peace listening. I would challenge us to flip this to peace listening, which is what we did in Mozambique. After 2 failed peace processes, there was little appetite for the classical setup. In fact, when we formed the back channel to start direct talks between the president and the then Renamo leader, Afonso Lacama, they refused to sign any single document. They said that we've been signing documents since 1992. We don't want to sign anything. Come up with something else. So we went back and said, okay, this is new, this is different, but let's take a risk. We have to be the ability. So we decided to start from scratch. We had nothing to lose. There were 2 failed processes. Why not try something new? We went back to the beginning, so to speak, and realized very quickly that the ability to listen is extremely difficult. Because normally when we listen to respond. Think about when you're having a conversation. Probably at the back of your mind, you're thinking, right, I'm listening to what you're saying, but what do I respond, right? And so we kind of flipped that. We can enhance peace listening by seeking out, people who are impacted by the conflict, being with people, hearing their stories without judgment, without question, and with humility. That's to honor human dignity. Without this, they wouldn't show vulnerability or trust. To do this, we must also flip what I like to call the gratitude narrative. So often, and I've been working now 20 years in between the North and the Southern sort of hemispheres. And normally it's when a country is in conflict, when people are at their lowest, there's this idea that it's them who should be grateful that you are coming in to help, to save. And I think that's exactly the opposite. We need to change the way we think, because conflict is deeply personal. And it's us, the peace builders, peacemakers, peace mediators, whatever we call ourselves, are the ones who are supposed to be grateful, because they're allowing us into this deeply personal space. So that, and once we start changing that, once we started flipping the way to think, we realized that we treasured that a lot more and we protected that mediation space a lot more. In Mozambique, the then Swiss ambassador Mirko and I, as you saw, we went to the parties and started conducting shuttle diplomacy, back and forth between the government and the Renamo leader. But unlike other talks, unlike the Avenida one, unlike the Joaquim Chissano Center one in 2013, which I was a part of both of those failed processes. So by now I had like a good little book on what not to do. We decided to go to the Renamo military base in rural Gorongosa, in Mozambique, rural Mozambique. This also took a long time to convince the government, because he said, I can't have a Swiss ambassador and a Kenyan floating around my country. What if something happens? I have ultimate responsibility, etc. So, but we refused to start without that, because to say that one party should come to the site of the other party, that in itself is a non-starter. If we want to converse with somebody, we need to go to their space. So we decided to wait until everybody was comfortable with this, until the security could be guaranteed, et cetera, et cetera. I won't bore you with the details, but we decided we weren't starting this until we were able to go to the bush. And not that any of you guys know me, but I am not one for the great outdoors at all. Like, I've been sitting in my air conditioning like pretty much the whole day and venturing out at night. So this was very difficult for me, outside my comfort zone. We didn't require Renamo nor its leaders to come to the city. Through 30 to 40 missions, I think I counted 43 at the latest, in the space of 6 years, we went up the mountain and through the bush. We listened to what people wanted. We listened to the soldiers' concerns, their hopes for the future. While it sometimes seemed like we were at an impasse and nothing was happening, over time it emerged that we were actually building trust with the principals, and most importantly, building confidence in the peace process and each other. So we all had to learn to first like each other, trust the process. Secondly, a national process. Now, I love this word, because almost in every single norm, you hear, oh, this has to be a national process. This has to be a national process. 9 times out of 10, it isn't. It's very much imposed. It's very much with an agenda. How often do we hear this? How often is this a reality? In Mozambique, having experienced the two processes already, we realized that quickly that it's not going to be sustainable if there's no genuine buy-in. We created a specific bespoke process design that prioritized the needs of the country. Structures shouldn't be seen as technical processes. They must really, really function and adapt according to the needs of the parties. What was important about these structures is that they fostered a sense of inclusion that was strategic. Here's another word, inclusion. So having sort of heard that inclusion is important, I don't deny this. And I think that I agree with you that there is no peace process that will work or is sustainable without real inclusion. But I think that it should be strategic inclusion, not the inclusion that has been set out in the norms, in the books, in the mediation world at the moment. In Mozambique, what we did is we did include, but we included strategically and at times. So it wasn't just a tick in the box. It wasn't everybody around a table and let's have a civil society representative, have a gender representative, and we have inclusion. We didn't do this. So we did it in phases. We decided to do it with one goal in mind, which was how to achieve an agreement. As you've seen already from the video, nothing would have passed in parliament if it wasn't inclusive, etc. But I think one of the major lessons that I've learned is that inclusion, like gender, can be done in a more strategic way, in a way that makes real sense. And of course, on gender, we're going to be speaking tomorrow, so I won't speak very much on that. But to create such a structure, it's a language of culture that most people need to learn and understand. There's a lot of emphasis on knowing the local languages. And understanding the local context. Both are useful and both are important, because if you can't communicate, how will you mediate, right? But I think that there's something missing in our language and the way we speak about this. It's, to my mind, it's culture. Culture is what makes human beings tick. It forms the basis for motivations, biases, behavior. It's what's unspoken that matters. For me, my experience in Mozambique was very, very interesting, because I come from East Africa, where people just say what they think. And you don't have to double guess, there's not much double speak in countries like Kenya, Nigeria. But in Mozambique, it was what was unspoken. It was what they were not saying that almost, that is the loudest, right? My third point, flexibility. Peace processes are not linear, as you said as well. They require flexibility. Strategy should be developed every day in the field. I always say every day is a negotiation. Like, we're negotiating every day, whether we know it or not. By creating an agile process, which can adapt quickly to the changing context, we saw multiple challenges arise. From the death of the Renamo leader, rise of the military junta, from the group a few days before the agreement was signed, suddenly there was a junta that emerged. Yeah, it was quite mad. Like, in terms of what had gone on, all the challenges that were faced at every step of the way, we had, the COVID-19 pandemic. It delayed the DDR. It would have delayed the DDR for 2 years, but we didn't allow that to happen. We basically, went persistence. We continued and continued. We adapted the process and said, okay, we'll take the Ministry of Health on board. We will bring the doctors, the nurses to the bush. But, we just redesigned it quickly. There were 2 cyclones in 1 year. So all the attention of the country and the government, rightly so, was in Beira and in Cabo Delgado, where there were 2 cyclones, which, in a country like Mozambique, decimated it. There was Cabo Delgado as well. So for every challenge we faced, we kept the focus on the process. For example, when the leader of the former combatants, who you saw also in the video, that we were negotiating with for like 2+ years, 2-3 years, died suddenly of natural causes, of pneumonia, like out of the blue, unpredictable. We then thought, how do we maintain trust in this? The biggest fear for everyone was, okay, now that Lakama is gone, peace process is dead. We then thought, okay, what can we do? What is the big signal? What is the big sign? And so we convinced the government to give him an official funeral, not a state funeral, but an official funeral. And you saw some pictures of that. This really, it worked. The gesture maintained the opposition group's faith in the process, and an MOU on military affairs, which was signed a few months later. When the insurgency in Cabo Delgado broke out, the north of the country, we shifted focus to that, realizing the need for balance and pragmatism. Because what's the point in discussing and pushing your agenda, your issue on the peace process when everyone's attention is in the north of the country? So have a bit of a break and start focusing and trying to help the government manage the issue in Cabo Delgado. Finally, and I think my most important thing, I think if there was one thing that you could take away today, and that is my personal favorite, because it rarely ever happens, is being comfortable with failure. If there's one thing that you could take away, it's that to create an atmosphere of being comfortable with failure, it's failure that allows us to take risks. And with risks comes even the remotest possibilities of success. I can't tell you how many times people told me in Mozambique over the time that I've been there, Renamo will never disarm, the government will never decentralize or elected governors. Both those things happen by the end of it. So what else? The point of what I'm trying to say is that you're persistent enough. You have to sometimes believe more in something than people believe in it, and remain consistent. If you're not ready to fail, you'll never have the courage to start. And I say this because in a lot of sort of international norms, if you talk about donors, whether you talk about internationals, the first question they always ask you, what's your risk mitigation strategy? You know what I said? None. I don't have one. Literally, don't have one. We don't have a risk mitigation strategy because you don't know. Conflicts are personal. Life is malleable. Things are fungible. Anyway, I see the level of success of any mediation process or any kind of process, not through monitoring frameworks, analysis, not through Excel worksheets that my colleagues love filling out, but it's in how much risk someone is willing to take for you. Think about that for a second. How much risk somebody is willing to take for you and for your process or in the process is a measure of success. In the video, you might have noticed or seen the president shaking hands with a group of women combatants in the bush. You might have seen both of them huddled in the bush on chairs with like camping chairs, etc. I'll tell you a little bit about that. That was quite historic for us. On the 6th of August, we finally convinced the president to go to the bush to talk to Lakama. And you can imagine the angst that resulted from that mere suggestion, which was, no, he should come here. I'm the president. Why? And we said, it's because you're the president. It's because you're the president. This is your country. You go everywhere you want. And so we managed after a while. And that was actually historic because Filipe Nyusi is the only president of Mozambique who's ever been to the bush. All the other, he's the only one who's ever been to the bush, to the territory of Renamo. The Geneva Centre and the other ones, they've been in Maputo, all the talks, any other meeting they've had. So this is the first time a sitting president has gone to the bush, which was amazing because I remember the next day in Capital, which was the biggest economic magazine in Mozambique, had a picture of the both of them, and it said the handshake that broke the. Exactly. Yeah. So these kind of signals, these kind of signs, this kind of ingenuity is what one needs, right? Taking risks, doing something different, etc. Implementing while negotiating was also a standout feature of the process in Mozambique. I began by saying that they refused to sign a document. And at the same time, Ethiopia was happening where there was South Sudan. There were lots of conflicts at that time where you have people signing something, next day it's broken. So they refused to sign anything. We decided, okay, there's no need for any signature. Let's just start slowly, kind of like marriage counseling. You do this, you do this, you do this, you do this. Little confidence building measures to just build up the trust in the process, because everybody by the end of 2 failed processes were so disappointed in everything that it was very hard. And then in all of this, we forget one big thing, human emotion. Politicians have emotions, leaders have emotions, and they're hard. And this is something that people don't kind of, you don't get taught that. With the Mozambique process, before any peace agreement was signed, in December 2016, a ceasefire was announced, subsequently made indefinite. DDR process began before anything was signed. This allowed us to overcome this fear of failure, build up the process, build up faith in the process, and make it more resilient. While every peace process is unique and different, by reflecting on our work, we can find that lessons can be relevant for other contexts as well. In Mozambique, despite the challenges, we managed to successfully demobilize over 5,000 former combatants, including 271 women, who are now at home with their families. This was done through a human-centered, gender-centric approach that provided DDR beneficiaries from 16 bases across the country with the necessary tools to transition to civilian life. It wasn't easy. We don't have the time now, and I won't bore you with the details, but every part of this process was done with the person in mind, even though it took long, which is why at the end, it took 6 or 7 years to achieve this. For example, we took services to the bush and directly to the assembly areas. In rural Mozambique, you barely have internet, never mind anything else. So you can imagine what it means when I say that in an assembly area, we took Vodacom, we took BCI, the banking system, we took the government department that makes national ID cards and birth certificates. So and the food fair, that's my favorite. So you just go, and each stall has like the pani puri and that and that. And so we designed it like that, like a food fair or a jobs fair, where the combatant gets off the bus from the bush or walks down the mountain, whichever may be the case, and each booth has one thing. You might have seen a few pictures from that, but if you go to our website, everything's on there. But it was a really unique design, which is what the UN highlighted, because it wasn't in any of that's not how they designed processes. So it was like a job set. So by the time the combatant gets off the bus, he goes booth by booth. By the time he exits, he's got a national ID card. He's got a birth certificate. He's got a bank ID card, a bank debit card. He's got the reinsertion material that is necessary in all DDR cases. Anyway, my point here is that it took us longer. What I'm trying to say in all of this is, if you notice the threads in my speech, a lot of it is to do with patience and time. We had no problem spending more time to get a better gain. We didn't rush anything. So fine, if it took us 2 or 3 months to convince the head of BCI, the bank in Mozambique, that, come to the bush. Because also people from Maputo, the capital city, some of them very rarely go to the bush. I mean, I know so many people in Maputo have told me that I've seen more of Mozambique than they would have. And I was like, not by choice, not by choice. Either way, we took services to the bush directly to the assembly areas. Private sector, government entities, they traveled with us to the bush. When COVID pandemic hit, we convinced the Ministry of Health to assign us, doctors to assign us, and we'll follow your rules and regulations, we'll wear our masks, we'll do all of this, but we cannot stop this process, because when you stop not without a reason, but when you stop for too long, doubt. And this is not good. So finally, I'm not going to take up too much time, but I'd like to tell you about something that encapsulates everything that I've said: risk, fear of failure, everything. We embarked on something quite crazy, which is the topic of pensions. And the topic of pensions is not the sexiest topic at all, neither for the World Bank, neither for any government who's trying to reduce its debt. They don't want to then tell you, oh yes, no, let's pay pension to former combatants, etc. But this was, we studied 1992, we studied 2013. I was part of 2013 and part of the Avenida process. So I knew that the only thing these combatants wanted, it wasn't about the money. Exactly. It was security. It was belonging. They wanted to belong. And what is the biggest example of belonging? Everybody just wants to belong somewhere, whether it's a community, whether it's a family. And so the Renamo combatants going into the government pension system is an example of a true and the only example you need of real reconciliation. Because in the beginning, there were all these thoughts of, oh, well, why don't we create a separate structure? Why don't we do that? We said no. We said, if it takes you 2 years to convince, for us to convince you, for you to convince your constituencies, we'll wait. But we want to do this the right way. And as I said, we weren't on any time crunch. We had the luxury of failure. So we had to get this right. Anyway, it took us almost 2 years of negotiations every which way. And we took the risk knowing we might fail, because there's no other peace process in the world today that I know, and maybe you can correct me, that have paid pensions to former combatants. I mean, I was on a panel at the Oslo Forum with President Santos before the pensions decreto was passed. And he very clearly said, you'll never make this happen. This is impossible. And I was like, okay, maybe, but let's try. The pensions decree was passed. The Peace Process Secretariat is now working on putting all these Renamo combatants who are now at home, but now we have to go looking for them to then put them into the national pension system. So this was quite historic and a pretty big success, I might say. Anyway, to end, as the world continues to be inundated with conflicts from Sudan to Gaza to Ukraine, DRC, Mali, I'm sure I'm leaving out like 100 others. We can't afford to see only challenges, nor lose any hope. We have to carve out opportunities for peace. But there's no rule book that says the UN, the AU, structures, whether it's like HD, like organizations. I think anyone can. Look at my example. This is not my field. I had no clue. I fell into this by accident, and I can tell you later how. However, even if you look at the video, Mirko was the Swiss ambassador. I was a consultant. I was a consultant floating in and out of the country. So I wasn't attached to anything. It was only when the peace agreement in 2019 was signed and Mirko's term was up that we realized, we still have to finish implementation, because we had started implementing the peace process before the signature of the agreement. It was only after in 2018, when the decentralization was passed and when the military affairs document was signed, it was then that the parties said, now don't we need a peace agreement, a big show? And we said, okay, but what are we going to do? We've already implemented 60%. So it was for the implementation of DDR that we thought, okay, now the UN can be useful because the process is not secret anymore. And it needs to be widened up. It needs to be opened up. And that's how then Mirko became envoy. And that's when I joined. But for the majority of my time, I was literally a nobody. I never even told anybody who I worked for, what I did. So suffice to say is that it's possible if there are two things: fear of failure, taking risks, calculated, measured, but take risks. It's my hope that continuing to share the story from Mozambique, it serves as an example and an inspiration to other countries, to other people, to other contexts, to never give up, because it is possible. Thank you.